And we first found out about Jim's passing, I guess. Little note on Facebook, and someone else saw it, and first person that responded that I saw was Renee. Renee is my niece. Her mother was Becky, who passed away. So Becky sends Renee today and as her stand-in, her family. And she said, she had two verses. One was Psalm we've been using in the program. The other was the one that Byron read. But when she put that on Facebook, I thought of that one phrase in there in Psalms 23, I think it is. It says, "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death." I felt like I'm walking through the valley of that shadow. Not my death, but his. And so I prepared notes so I don't get too emotional or forget. But and also this painting was done by my father, and so that's his representation today. And I think it's appropriate. It's Jesus in Gethsemane when he was in great anguish. In fact, it says he was in such great anguish that blood came out of his pores. He was in great anguish and probably considered taking his life in such anguish. My father that painted this, his last years were in great pain. He suffered with Parkinson's disease and, the trembling. But what people don't realize about Parkinson's, after a while, you begin to kind of shrink in and pull in, and you're just in constantly tight. And he was in pain. I don't know how many years it lasted. 6 or 8 years. He suffered with that thing, and Mom stayed with him. She wouldn't hire a nurse, and she lost a lot of sleep because he was constantly getting up. He'd move and he'd wake up, and Mom was there to rub his neck or whatever. And so you wonder why some people have to suffer so much. My dad was a member of this church, and he actually helped design the church. He drafted some of the plans for this area up here. There used to be a railing, and I know he was part of the designing all that. He brought us to church here, and my brother and I got saved in 1959. We were baptized in this place back here. Well, my oldest memories and the strongest images that I have, my most fond memories of childhood, almost all of them, my old memories, are associated with Jim. From birth to about the age of 16, he was my constant companion. There was only a year apart in our age. We were like twins, We were so close in age that at Christmas we get the same presents because we were the same age, going through the same, wanting to have paper, whatever kids play with, we usually had the same thing. That way we didn't fight over him either, because he had the same gun I had, he had the same helmet, But and every once in a while, it wasn't like these twins here, but every once in a while we dress the same, but these girls, they dress the same all the time because they're real twins. We shared the same bed, and when we got older, we shared the same bunk. We wrestled and punched each other, usually body shots. I remember when we started hitting each other in the face, we didn't know we could do that, and we were kind of like awkward about it, but the best gift that we ever got was a pair of boxing gloves. And we had lots of fights. Usually the fights would start in an argument, and maybe there was anger. A lot of times those fights ended with, those arguments escalated to a fight, and maybe one of us or two of us would cry, but the next day everything was okay. We get up, play, sometimes we fight, sometimes we do that, but we never got up mad at each other. We played outside almost every day. We lived catty corner from Lou Wallace over here, so we had a playground less than a block away. We'd jump the fence, we'd play baseball and basketball, football. Usually by ourselves. There was neighborhood kids, but usually it was one-on-one competition. We learned to swim together down at the Y. One of my favorite activities was water guns and water balloons. Every once in a while we'd shoot Ginger, and if she cried, the punishment was take the water gun away and smash it with a hammer. Some of my best water guns were destroyed that way. And over here in the educational building, there's a bathroom, and I think it's close to the stairs, but anyway, my brother and I would go in there and we'd fill up water balloons, and I'd set my Bible, this Bible, on the toilet. And one day when I was filling up water balloons, I dropped my Bible in the toilet. And so I carried this Bible around for a couple of years stained with toilet water. I still carry it around. I guess germs after a while, they go away. But we terrorized some of the visitors at this church with water balloons. I don't know how we got away with that. It seemed like somebody would have said something, but we did it over and over again. I remember one 4th of July, we got up on top of the church where there's a little balcony thing up there and shot bottle rockets at people coming to church. And we rode, on that same subject, we rode bicycles most every day. Sometimes we'd get an armful of balloons, water balloons, ride down through the downtown area and throw balloons in the open car windows. I guess we'd have snow fights, but we'd also throw snowballs at passing cars. And I guess we did a lot of things. I could tell you a lot of things that we did, but it's kind of like Huckleberry Finn and Tom Sawyer. We did a lot of things together. Byron got us a shotgun when we were pretty young. It was one of those things you break open, put one shot in, and close it up. Taught us some gun safety and took us hunting down by the Rio Grande and hunted for doves and quail. When Byron left, Roy Carden, Charlene's dad, she's here, he started doing things that Byron did, taking us hunting. And one time we were out, it's lucky I just had one shot, because one time we were out hunting with Mr. Carden, and Jim and I were standing about here, and Mr. Carden was over here somewhere, and a bird flew this way. I raised up my shotgun, and Mr. Carden ducked. And I still hit some pellets on the back of his jacket, but anyway, we had a lot of fun. And many of you know, and it's already come out a little bit, that it looks like my brother took his own life. We'll never really know for sure. It's possible someone may have killed him and tried to cover it up. I don't know. To us, it doesn't seem like it's possible, but we're just going to assume that that's the way it happened. But knowing that he might have taken his life, it causes us great pain, anguish, hurt, shame, uncertainty, and anger, and just a whole lot of what-ifs. And I want to share some hope with you where there's despair. I want to share some of the truth where there's lies. And I want to comfort you so that I too can be comforted. And what does the Bible really say about suicide? Well, for one thing, that word is really not in the scriptures, but there were 3 men that took their own lives. Samson, he was a man of great faith and had tremendous strength. He took a Nazirite vow not to drink alcohol, touch any unclean thing. And he was not supposed to cut his hair. And so he had long hair, and this was really, it's like us that go through baptism. It was a sign of his inward vow, the long hair. But it was tied to his relationship with God. And so he got involved in cares of the world. He found some women and started drinking, and he was with one of these women, and she finally convinced him what the secret of his success, of his strength was. I mean, he was so strong that one time he went to a city, pulled the gate off its hinges, and carried it away. He slew a bunch of men with the jawbone of an ass, and he could do anything. He could do almost anything he wanted. But when he got involved with this woman, he said, "Well, I've taken a Nazirite vow, and I've promised to be holy and to not do these things." And probably she thought, "Well, it doesn't seem like we're being holy, Mr. Samson." But he said, "And it's my long hair." And so he probably passed out, and she cut his hair off, brought in some men, they bound him, took him away and gouged his eyes out, made him grind out the wheat like an animal. And as he did that, over some time, I don't know how long it was, his strength began to return, but he was blind and a defeated man. And so one day his enemies took him out for a festival just to make fun of him. They tied him up somewhere and say, look at great Samson over here. Look at he's a blind man, he can't do anything. And he convinced a little boy, he says, "Take me to the pillars of this temple." And he went to the pillars and he pushed them apart. The structure fell, and it says something like 3,000 men died that day, and it was more men than he had ever killed before. But in doing that, he killed himself. And there's no judgment in the word about that. In fact, he's regarded mostly as a hero, except for some failings, The other man was the first king of Israel, Saul. He seemed like he was the perfect choice for Israel. God was hoping they would follow him, but Israel needed a king, they said, and so they picked Saul. It says he was head and shoulder above everyone else. Apparently he was just a huge man. He was great in battle, and everybody liked him. But one day he went to battle, and God told him, usually through the prophet, he says, "When you go to this place, kill everything. Kill everyone there, including the animals." That seems pretty harsh. Well, Saul decided to spare the king and a few others, and he spared some animals. And so the prophet comes and says, "Did you do what God told you to do?" He says, "Oh yeah, I did that." And he says, well, the prophet says, "Well, what's that bleating I hear?" And he says, "Oh, I saved some sheep and oxen, and I'm going to have a sacrifice for God for what happened today." And the prophet said, "You just disobeyed, And from that time forward, he ceased to be the king of Israel. God found another man in David. He consorted with a witch, and God was just not coming to speak to him anymore. In his last day, Saul was on the battlefield, and an archer got him. He knew he was mortally wounded, and he asked his armor bearer, "I know when they get me, they're going to torture me. They're going to ridicule me, take my life." And the armor bearer wouldn't do it. So he took a sword and fell on a sword, I don't know if his own, and took his own life. Well, like he thought, when they found him, they stripped him, cut off his head, nailed his body to a wall, and 3 of his sons were there, and they did the same thing to them. And then it says that some valiant men from Jabesh Gilead heard what had happened, so they went in the night, found Samson, and they found Saul and his 3 brothers nailed to the wall. They took the bodies down, burned them, and took the bones back to where they lived and buried it under a tree. It says the people fasted for 7 days. So they didn't judge him for taking his life. And in fact, it says they fasted and they gave him a proper burial. And probably the one you're most familiar with is Judas. He was one of the 12 disciples. But if you read in Psalms and other places, it says of Judas, he was called his friend. He was the one that betrayed him, but he called him his friend. Somewhere along the line, Judas, I don't know if he was discouraged or what, there's a lot of speculation about what Judas was up to, but he turned them over to the chief priests and elders, and they agreed on 30 pieces of silver for the cost of it, for doing that deed. He went and had the last meal with Jesus and the disciples. They call it the Last Supper. And he hasn't turned them in yet. He's just agreed on a price. And while 12 of them are sitting there, Jesus says, one of you is going to betray me. And nobody could imagine that. But Jesus said, the one that sops your bread and the wine, and Judas did that. And even when he did it, the disciples didn't really know what was going on. And he told Peter, you're going to deny me too. But what happened was, I don't know if Judas really knew what was going to happen, but it soon became apparent that Jesus was going to be dead. The consequence for turning him in was they were going to kill him. It says that Judas repented. He went back, took the money back, and said, "Here's your money. I've betrayed innocent blood." And the chief elders and priests, they said, "What's that to us?" So he remorsefully left, repented, it says, went out and hung himself. And it was this particular act of Judas, this betrayal and suicide, that has led to so much false teaching about suicide. They assumed that this man Judas, because of what he did and then committed suicide, he was going to hell. And if you believe that lie, and I think it's a lie, people think he went to hell, but he was his friend. If you believe that lie, then Christianity took on this idea that anyone that commits suicide is going to hell. And in fact, for centuries, the Catholic Church would not bury someone a Christian burial if they had committed suicide. I don't know what their stand today is, but that was for a very long time. But I want you to understand this. Biblically, truthfully, committing suicide is not the unpardonable sin. There's still room for forgiveness, and it doesn't even depend on a last-minute confession. In the last moments of Jesus' life, he said, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." And when he said this, do you think he was just talking about the Roman soldiers that had put the nails in his hands? Or when he said, "Father, forgive them," it was more. He was forgiving those Roman soldiers, yes. He was forgiving the ones that beat him. He was forgiving the ones that struck him during the trial. He was forgiving those that whipped him, gave him 39 lashes. When Jesus said, "Father, forgive them," he was forgiving the man that spit in his face. He was forgiving those that ridiculed him and stripped him. He was even forgiving the crowds that said, "Crucify him." He was forgiving Pilate and his wife. He was forgiving the chief priests and elders. He was speaking of Peter that denied him in the trial. And yes, when he said, "Father, forgive them," he was speaking of Judas too. And it's essential that everyone realize this. When he said that word, he wasn't just talking about the Roman soldiers that brought his death. He was referring to all men. You know, I'm not promoting suicide. It is sinful. One of the 10 Commandments says, "Thou shalt not kill." Taking your own life, that's sinful. But it's not the unpardonable sin. I mean, could any of you condemn Saul for committing suicide when he knew he was going to be tortured? It was proven that he was going to do that. Or someone that's dying of cancer takes their own life. I find it hard to judge someone like that. Those people that jumped out of the Twin Towers, they knew they were going to burn to death, and I don't know how many, more than one, maybe a dozen people jumped out. I remember seeing a picture of a man and a woman holding hands as they jumped out the window. But I can't condemn them for wanting to avoid suicide, to avoid being burned to death. There was a psalmist that penned this line. He said, he could have called 10,000 angels to destroy the world. He didn't. Instead, he died for you and me. Jesus knew that he was going to be betrayed and crucified. Why didn't he just run away? Why didn't he hide? Or why didn't he incite a riot and topple the Roman government? He was capable of that. Instead, he gave his life freely. At the beginning of Jesus' ministry, he was tempted by Satan in 3 ways. First, Jesus was in the wilderness and he had fasted for 40 days, and Satan said, "Why don't you turn this stone into bread?" I'm sure he was hungry. He said, "Man cannot live by bread alone." And then Satan took him to a place where he could view most everything, and he said, "Everything the world has, I'll give it to you. All you got to do is worship me." And he wasn't just talking about something casual. He was offering him everything: fame, fortune, any sin, any passion. It was all available to him. And he said, "Thou shalt worship the Lord thy God, and him only." And then it says he took him to Jerusalem and set him on a pinnacle on the top of the temple. And he said, "If you are the Son of God, then cast yourself down." Doesn't the word say that God will catch you, or the angels will catch you, and you'll not even dash your feet against the stones? And Jesus' reply was, "Thou shalt not tempt the Lord your God." And honestly, this last part of the testing of Jesus, the temptations, I've always worried or wondered about this last temptation. It seems like he's telling him, just see if God will catch you, like he's some kind of thrill seeker, like a bungee cord or something, because he knows at the last minute God's going to snatch him out. I mean, that doesn't make sense to me. That's not really a temptation unless you're a lunatic or a circus performer or something, you know. And then I hear this other explanation often. The real thing there was that you should not tempt the Lord your God. And still I have trouble putting a hand on it. I don't really understand that explanation for that. But the word says specifically that Jesus was tempted in every way that we're tempted. In Hebrews 4:15 it says, we do not have a high priest that cannot be touched with the feeling of our infirmities, but he was tempted in all ways like we were, but without sin. Well, I've never been tempted to turn stone into bread, but I have been hungry. I've tried to fast, and after a short time of fasting, 2 or 3 days, I'm ready to eat anything. You know, he went 40 days. And I've never been tempted to rule the world, but I have looked at some of those things. I've been tempted to, take the easy road or whatever, seeking pleasure instead of things that God has for us. I can relate to those 2 things. But this third temptation, it seems odd to me, but that Satan would use the last temptation for something that doesn't even seem to me a temptation. So a few days ago, my brother took his life. And I was weeping and staring off into space and looking for an answer. My brother was a psychiatrist. If you go on the internet and look up suicide prevention in Pueblo, Colorado, his name pops up. He knew what that was, and he knew what to do. He was a Christian. You would think he's a Christian, he wouldn't be doing stuff like that. I'm sure there were many things that troubled him. By most standards, he was well off, but I suppose maybe depression might have clouded his judgment. I know that we find comfort when we mourn. And somewhere in that dark hour, for me, Jesus spoke and he said, I was tempted to take my life. So when I look back again at the temptation of Christ, I saw it a little more clearly. Jesus knew that he must suffer, but seeing the joy that was set before him, he endured the cross. He clearly stated, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I'll build it again. He was talking about his own body. Satan took him up to a pinnacle, the topmost part in Jerusalem probably. He could see everything around. And he knew from that, looking around, he knew that his friend Judas would betray him. He knew that Peter would deny him. He knew his disciples would scatter. He knew he would suffer at the hands of Pilate. He knew that he would be scourged and beaten and ridiculed. He knew they would tear out his beard. He knew they would spit in his face. He even knew that he would be tempted to perform miracles for his own self. He knew his mother would be alone. He knew they would strip him naked and put a crown of thorns on his head. He knew that he would be hung on a cross and suffer a horrible death. He knew all these things so that on that day when Satan tempted him to jump off the temple, he considered it right there. But it says about Jesus, he was tempted like we were, but not with sin. He did not sin. He submitted to the cross, seeing the joy that was set before him. It's not sinful to have those kind of thoughts, but I think that's why we avoid that third temptation, because we don't want to assume that Jesus could be tempted to commit suicide. But look at all the things that he was facing. It says when he was in the garden, he was in such anguish that blood was pouring out of his pores. Even at that time, when everything's falling apart, I think he was still tempted to do something. That psalmist said he could have called 10,000 angels. I believe it. I think he had the power to, it says one time they were trying to kill him, the crowds came in, they were pressing in trying to grab him so they could stone him. It says he just passed through the crowd. You know, as a kid, I thought he was like somebody that knew kung fu or something. He could do anything. But instead, he allowed them to take him to the cross and submitted to it. And one of the last things he says, Father, if it's possible, take this cup from me. He really didn't want to do it. Even though it says he, knowing the joy that was set before him, he went to the cross, he was frightened. He was hurting. Jesus went to the cross so that he could bear our shame and our guilt. He went to the cross and bore our diseases and a certain death so that we could live forever. I know that Jesus prayed for my brother that day when he said, Father, forgive him because he doesn't know what he's doing. I forgive my brother for what he did, and I ask that you forgive him too. I forgive anyone that had any part in pushing him in that direction. And I ask God to forgive us for having those suicidal thoughts as well. But don't neglect so great a salvation. Don't spend an eternity without him. Like David said of his son, but something similar. I can't raise my brother from the dead, but I can go to him, and I will walk with him in eternity. My brother was always bigger, taller, stronger most of the time, smarter, sang better, played the guitar better, made better grades, had a better job, all this stuff. But he always treated me as his equal. And we never borrowed money from each other, but we shared most things we had. I saw Jim a few times, but the last time I saw him was in Las Vegas, New Mexico. I was here in Albuquerque with my wife, and I wanted to see him. I didn't have much money. I think I had $25 in my pocket, and I put 20 in the car, and Jan and I drove up to Las Vegas. And when it came time to eat, I realized I didn't have enough money to go get something to eat, but I just told Jim, feed us. And it was kind of a joke, but I didn't want to let him know that I didn't have any money, so he took us downtown and fed us a chicken dinner. But last week, this incident where I went to Jim and told him to feed me. I said, in my mind I was thinking, I ought to call Jim and tell him about that incident and maybe apologize or just explain it, or just maybe it was just an excuse to talk to him. But I just kind of let that thought pass, and a few hours later I got a message that Jim was missing, and sometime later I found out he was dead. Maybe I should have paid more attention to that thought. Maybe it wasn't too late when I had that thought. Maybe I could have called him and encouraged him. Maybe I could have shared his burden. But maybe it was just my brother sending him back a message from eternity saying, do not neglect this great salvation.